Hey everyone, and welcome back to a new video. Since Games Workshop announced Legions Imperialis a few months ago, there's been quite a few comments about whether setting a new epic style game in the Horus Heresy was the right call. Epic 40k, for example, was a great game that's very nostalgic for many people, and the feedback shows, if anything, that there's a real appetite for it to come back in some form. And while I personally feel the Horus Heresy makes sense as a setting for GW to start dipping its toe back into epic scale Warhammer, I can see why people are disappointed that we won't see the return of releases like Swordwind anytime soon. But putting that aside for a moment, I do think it's worth opening up the conversation a little. Epic 40k was certainly iconic, but Games Workshop did bring Epic to other franchises, including Lord of the Rings with the Battle of Five Armies and Warhammer Fantasy with Warmaster. And in this video, I want to talk about whether, rather than Epic 40k, we might just see the return of Warmaster in the somewhat distant future. If you're keen to hear more about that, then let's jump right in. So if you're not already familiar with Warmaster, it was a roughly 10mm tabletop game set in the Warhammer Fantasy universe that, like Legions Imperialis, saw players battle it out with much vaster armies than they could normally field on the tabletop. It originally came out in the year 2000 and at the time was one of Games Workshop's specialist Warhammer games, alongside Inquisitor, Battlefleet Gothic and a few others. However, it soon got a bit more mainstream support from the company, and while it certainly wasn't marketed as heavily as Fantasy or 40k, it was quite regularly featured in White Dwarf and other publications. As a bit of a side note, there was a later version of Warmaster called Warmaster Ancients that modified the rules and let you play historical battles running from biblical times all the way to 1066, followed by an expansion that included medieval battles. So clearly GW quite enjoyed the epic format and was keen to play about with it. But by 2006, GW had grown the original Warmaster game to include quite a few armies, including High Elves, Empire, Dwarves, Chaos, Orcs and Goblins, Undead, Dark Elves, Skavian, Bretonnians, Lizardmen, Kislev Demons and Araby. Basically, if you played Fantasy at the time, there was plenty more waiting for you in Warmaster, and it was a real hit with many players looking to try a slightly different tactical game in a setting they really loved. Then that all changed in 2013 when Games Workshop stopped producing the models and support for the game and simply left it to slowly drift off. This was about 2 years before Warhammer Fantasy itself came to an end and was replaced by Age of Sigmar, and while so much of the reasoning behind that transition is speculative, we can guess that the models and concepts for AOS were in the works when Warmaster was wound down, preempting what was to come for the wider setting. The game itself played exactly how you might expect given its title. It was heavily themed on commanding units and activating them as they manoeuvred across the battlefield. There was magic and shooting, but they were more focused about forcing enemy units to fall back than actually doing lethal damage. The result was a game of intense tactical placement and, in my view, was very akin to what eventually came about with the Total War games on PC and the like. So that's a quick look at Warmaster itself, and the immediate question to answer is, would GW ever consider bringing it back? Well, to be clear, the game didn't ever truly die. The community, ever the custodians of so much of Warhammer, have since taken over the rules, and there's actually a fan-supported version that you can check out. But naturally there's no way to get hold of the models, and so new players are a little stuck. So when I talk about bringing it back, I mean in the context of an official game, but definitely check out the fan page if you're interested. But going back to the question, I think one of the main reasons that many players dislike the idea of Legions Imperialis, that it has very similar factions fighting each other, is actually the reason GW is trying it. If you're going to launch a new game, or at least new for the vast majority of your customer base, having it rely on relatively few varieties of units helps to take some of the risk out. You don't really want to spend time and money designing, creating and producing lots of different models that then don't sell. However, if it's successful, then it opens up the way for more interest and focus on epic Warhammer. After all, you can count on GW and its shareholders to follow the cash. And while that could lead to epic 40k, which it may well do, you could argue that that then means there's two epic scale games in the 30k 40k setting. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. There's already plenty of crossover between 30k and 40k on the tabletop, but GW does somewhat like to spread the love across all of its IPs. You've got Necromunda and Warcry, Kill Team and Underworlds, Warhammer Quest and Blackstone Fortress. It's not a rule of thumb, sure, but the point I'm making is that a successful Legions Imperialis and a whiff of more cash might get GW to look a little further afield when thinking about where to base a new epic style game, and that would likely be some new iteration of Warmaster. That said, the bigger question then is what setting. By that point, if it ever happens, we'll have several different Warhammer Fantasy universes. Age of Sigmar, of course, which I think we can discount now just because I think GW wouldn't want to confuse or dilute customers with both large and small scale AOS. But then you'll also have classic Warhammer Fantasy from days of old and the newer Old World setting, and both could be good ones for a return to Warmaster. With classic fantasy, you could bring back many of the core races, maybe even just the old game altogether, and set it narratively during the end times or some of the campaigns we've read about in many of the army books and Black Library novels. Conversely, we know the Old World is set initially during the civil wars of the Empire, which will lead to its eventual unification and the arrival of Asavar Kul, the 12th ever chosen of Chaos, and a new era of conquest and bloodshed. Thinking about it, that Civil War setting would allow GW to do exactly what they're doing with Legions Imperialis, set the game in a civil war and thereby rely on fewer varieties of units battling it out against each other, Empire versus Empire forces in this case. Now, I can already feel some of you sighing with disappointment because it feels like a game run by marketing and sales rather than what players want, and you're right, but unlike the Horus Heresy, I think a successful Warmaster in that context can be grown to then have all the various races we'll not only see in the larger Old World game, but those that are missing too, including the Dark Elves, Lizardmen and so on. And then you're just a stone's throw away from releasing a new version that's set in the classic fantasy universe. It's a bit of a tinfoil concept, but it feels more likely given it's a safer bet for GW. They can leave it if it doesn't pick up without having spent tons of money developing 9 separate faction armies, and it lays the foundation for what players potentially want at the end of the day. But there's 2 final considerations I want to bring up, and they apply as much to the idea of Epic 40k coming back as they do for Warmaster. The first is cost. You only have to look back at old editions of White Dwarf to see how much GW's pricing has changed over the years. It's shocking anyways, but it really hits you when you see the numbers in print. But similarly, just as prices have inflated for Warhammer 40k and really all the existing Warhammer games, they'll do the same for new ones too. At the time of recording this, we don't know the prices of standalone units in Legions Imperialis, but whatever they cost, it will require a bit of investment on the player's part to get into the game, and we'd have to expect the same for Epic 40k or Warmaster if they were to return. That's not just a potential barrier for players, but also GW. The more thinly we spread our cash across Warhammer games, the less we spend in any one game, and oddly, it means we're probably less sticky as customers and likely to move about to new things, without that sense of sunk cost that probably keeps us in more than we care to admit. But either way, that heavier cost might be enough to give any new Epic game a different sort of taste to older and newer players, and if they do come back, we need to be prepared for that. The second consideration is scaling. Games Workshop has a lot of active Warhammer games, and we're covering potentially 2 more that many players want to see. But as you've noticed in recent months, they're struggling quite a bit in getting models out just for those existing games, and I can't imagine these 2 would make it easier. That said, if GW collectively treated all Epic formats together, they could try and manage them more as one game with different iterations, but I'm not sure how that would work or if that's what players want. The point I'm making is that above anything, GW doesn't want to drop the ball on its core games, and many players are desperately crying out for faster updates. Do we want Epic 40k or new Eldari models, brand new Warmaster or new Skaven? It's a real dilemma, but it's one we have to live with unless GW can find a way to scale in a way that hasn't proved easy given its recent issues. But before I close, I do want to say that a new iteration of Warmaster could potentially be a really fantastic game. It would hit the niche that GW is aiming for with Legions Imperialis, but in a setting that players are calling to go back to, albeit in a slightly different way. Plus, it could be a great one to set narrative storytelling that adds to either the Old World or the Warhammer Fantasy IP that is clearly doing wonders for them if Total War is anything to go by. In fact, it could be a great way to simply get Total War fans into the hobby, but that's probably a different conversation altogether. However, it's not easy, and I for one am going to do the best I can by supporting the Legions Imperialis launch. It's not everybody's cup of tea, but it's a solid start, and I really do think that the team behind it are probably the most ambitious of all of us when it comes to where Epic Warhammer sits amongst all the other games. So that's a few thoughts on the potential return of Warmaster. Again, no evidence beyond my own thoughts, but I'm quietly hopeful for it, and Epic 40k for that matter, but there's a lot more awesome Warhammer on the way regardless. But what do you think? Can you see Warmaster coming back? Did you play it back in the day? And can you think of any companies that have already shown why that scale still works well today? Let me know in the comments section. And as always, a huge thank you for joining me today. If you liked the video, please do click the like button and subscribe, and I do hope you'll join me for my next one. Until then though, do take care.